so I'm not even going to bore you with an introduction. To start us off, we've got FTC Commissioner Maureen Wellhausen. The Commissioner was sworn in at the Federal Trade Commission on April 4th, 2012 to a term that expires in September 2018. Prior to joining the Commission, Wellhausen was a partner at WBK, where she focused on FTC issues including privacy. And as everyone here knows, Wellhausen previously served at the Commission for 11 years, multiple tours of duty, lots of interesting posts at the FTC, and she's going to get us started off this morning with a recap of what the FTC has done and what you guys are looking at. Commissioner?
Thank you, Tony. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to provide some introductory thoughts on the topic of this panel on facial recognition technology. And I'll be doing that from the perspective of consumers, which is very appropriate at the Consumer Electronics Show. But the Federal Trade Commission's mission is to prevent business practices that are anti-competitive, deceptive, or unfair to consumers without unduly burdening legitimate industry. I think that goal has really withstood the test of time, and I think it's relevant to lots of topics, including facial recognition technology. So first, I want to share with you what the FTC has already done in this area and what we've learned from our activities, and what issues industry may want to keep in mind as they move forward and develop these new technologies. But first, I'd like to note that my comments are my own and do not necessarily represent the views of other FTC commissioners. So in talking about facial recognition technology, I really can't miss the opportunity to quote the line, "John Anderton, you could use a Guinness right about now," from the 2002 Minority Report movie, in which companies appeared to use biometric technology to identify people and serve them targeted ads. It was a very sort of arresting concept, I think, when I saw the movie 10 years ago. And it seemed very futuristic then, but I do think at least part of that future appears to be closer at hand. As you can see from people who visited the show floor, companies are already deploying facial recognition technologies in a wide variety of contexts, some of which are more technologically sophisticated than others. I think there's been a lot of coverage of the Panasonic TV, right, that pops up your content based, you have different members in a household, and whoever's watching the TV, their favorite content kind of pops up based on the TV recognizing who's sitting in front of it. But one of the things that I like to do is to be careful to make sure we're not lumping all different types of facial recognition technology and all different uses into one bucket, but to really understand them individually. So at the simplest level, this technology can be used for facial detection, which means basically just to say that there is a face and locate that face in a photo. So the current uses of that include refining search engine results to just find faces, locating faces in an image to blur them, ensuring that the frame for a video chat feed actually includes a face and not something else that might be disturbing, and developing things like virtual eyeglass fitting systems or virtual I don't want to get into too much detail, but anyway, virtual makeup tools that allow consumers to upload their photos and then virtually try on, say, a new pair of glasses or a new hairstyle. A more advanced version of facial recognition technology allows companies to assess characteristics of facial images, but still not identify a unique individual. But for example, companies can identify moods or emotions from facial expressions to determine a player's engagement with a video game or a viewer's interest or excitement during a movie. Companies can also place cameras into digital signs to determine demographic characteristics of a face, such as an age range and gender, and deliver targeted advertisements in real time based on that consumer's demographic profile. For example, it might show a 30-year-old man an advertisement for shaving cream, while a 50-year-old woman may be shown an ad for perfume. And an interesting use of the technology that we've heard about, one company has leveraged this ability to determine age range and gender to obtain aggregate demographic data about the clientele of bars and nightclubs via cameras placed at the entrances to these venues. And the company only stores this data in an aggregated form and not images of the venue's customers. But the way they use this is for vendors and third parties, such as liquor distributors, to understand the demographics of a particular venue's customers at certain times and possibly tailor their specials or promotions accordingly. So you can see that, this venue attracts a lot of, 30-year-old men at a certain time, and maybe you should, stock more beer there, or it has women at a different time. And then interestingly, the company also makes the aggregate information it collects available through a mobile app that customers can use to make decisions about which venues to patronize. So you can say, well, this bar has a lot of women at a certain time, I might try to go there, or has people around my age, that kind of thing, but not saying, this particular person is there at any particular time. So an even more sophisticated application currently in use is when companies use the technology to compare an individual's facial characteristics across different images to identify him or her. And in this application, an image of an individual is matched with other images of the same individual. And then if the face in either image can be identified by name, then the technology can identify a previously anonymous face in another photo. And so that's a use that, of course, is a little more, raises some more privacy implications than some of the more aggregate and general ones. So so why is this happening now? Technology is advancing. We've sort of had this idea in mind. We mentioned a Minority Report, but why is it really coming to the fore now? But until recently, because of high costs and limited accuracy, facial recognition technologies were not widely used on a commercial basis. But now that we've had improvements in higher quality digital cameras and lenses to create higher quality images from which biometric data can be more easily extracted, it makes facial recognition technology more feasible. And also for facial recognition technologies that match an image of an unknown face to an identified reference photo where the name of the individual is known. Until recently, it was a little difficult to do that because if the photos were taken from different angles, it was difficult to match. Like, is that really the same person? But with current technologies, their ability to generate a 3D face, a facial image, helps to reconcile the pose variations. These advances have also been spurred by the rapid growth in the availability of identified photos online. So until recently, most of the images available online were of public figures, celebrities, politicians, what have you. But today, there are many more sources of identified images of private citizens online. And the main driver for this is the rise in the popularity of social networking sites. And for example, it's reported that approximately 2.5 billion photos are uploaded to Facebook each month, which is really quite an amazing data set, really. And this multitude of identified images can eliminate the need to purchase proprietary sets of identified images, thus making it less costly to deploy facial recognition technologies commercially. I'm sure you're all familiar with the ability to tag people in photos, and I certainly, that kind of came to the forefront of my mind and became aware of it when the president nominated me to be an FTC commissioner. So all of a sudden you start saying, oh, gee, what photos are there out of me? Who has posted a photo about me, and what do I look like in that photo? So it's one of those things that, it's kind of a new world, certainly. I think I won't go into too much detail about how facial recognition technology actually works, but it basically uses biometric data about, the size of, how your eyes are spaced, what your skin tone looks like, and things like that to match it. So paying attention, the FTC, we like to try to pay attention to what new issues might be coming down the road for consumers so that we have a very good understanding of what some of these benefits might be, what some of the risks might be for consumers, and we have a pretty active policymaking function at the FTC. And in that vein, we did a workshop in December of 2011 on facial recognition technology, and from that we issued a report called the Facing Facts Report. And it recommended best practices for common uses of facial recognition technology. And so we had the workshop, we received a number of comments, and we issued this report setting out the best practices. But I want to be clear that the report is not intended to serve as a template for law enforcement or actions or regulations under current laws, but more a way to explore some of the issues and give companies some guidance on some steps they might want to take, some best practices to follow as they start to deploy facial recognition technology. And a lot of this was based on our March 2012 report, Protecting Consumer Privacy in an Era of Rapid Change. And we call upon companies handling consumer data to implement privacy by design by, for example, building in privacy protections at every stage in the development of their products and services, and to provide consumers with simplified choice, and to increase transparency by providing clearer, shorter, and more standardized privacy notices. So I won't go through all the recommendations in the report. I think it probably makes more sense for the panel to discuss this, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a preview of what some of the technologies are, what some of the issues that they could raise, and then some of the thoughts that the FTC is bringing to bear in this area. And there's also, I haven't touched on self-regulation and possibilities of new legislation, but we can certainly explore that further in the panel. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Commissioner. And we're definitely going to explore those questions and others. And just a reminder to all of you that a little bit later we are going to take audience questions, so keep that in mind. But now let's bring the rest of the panel into this. As you guys can see, we've got a great group here. Wayne Cruz from Wayne Cruz from CEI. It's one of those days, some of us did have a Guinness last night, apparently. Wayne Cruz from CEI, Scott Boylan, General Counsel of Morpho Trust, Pam Dixon, World Privacy Forum, Harley Geiger, Senior Alleged Counsel with Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, Baron Zoka from Tech Freedom. I want to start off by talking about the FTC report. The commissioner began by pointing out the consumer part of the Consumer Electronics Show, and there are a few lines in the report that actually speak directly to what consumers do and don't know. There's one section that says that, quote, consumers likely do not expect signs to detect their age range and gender and target and add to them in real time. And there's another section that says that consumers, quote, may not expect that some of those photos are stored by social networks used in what are essentially biometric databases. With that in mind, give us your perspective as we begin what's probably going to be a very lengthy debate over facial recognition privacy. What do you see as the issues at play, and what do you think consumers have to say about this new technology? Let's start going down the line. Wayne.
We got a face print of all of you coming in the door. He didn't get mine. And we're going to need a DNA sample on the way out. Look, we always start out on these biometrics discussions, I think, with a quote from the Minority Report movie, and I think that's actually a telling one. If you remember from that movie, the little spiders that were scampering into the house, the problem there was not that the technology could identify the individual, but that it came in through the door. And fundamentally, it's those Fourth Amendment concerns that matter the most with respect to biometrics. And what really is key, I think, is to recognize that the technology is very, very new, and the disputes about it first arose, it was about 10 years ago, a Super Bowl game where there were face cameras, and now face cameras remain a big debate. But I would maintain, and we may go into this later, but the private sector can and is capable of making you security guarantees and privacy guarantees. But we have this unfortunate coincidence of also being in a homeland security culture, and I think we'll talk about some of this as we go down the line. There was just a Wall Street Journal piece on December 12th about massive databases that the federal government is putting together. But when you think about biometrics, you can imagine biometrics as being fully compulsory, which would be the worst kind. That would be a national ID card, which comes up occasionally in these debates, and I'm sure we'll hear that again. Potentially compulsory, and that's the cameras out in the public and things like that. Ideally, with public cameras using biometric technologies, just like with those spiders slipping under the door in Minority Report, ideally, no information collection is taking place. In other words, the information collection against a targeted individual or individuals should have already happened and be in the database, and then that camera may be looking for a match or something like that. So you asked about expectations. I think consumers don't expect they're being put in databases and tracked everywhere they go. And those kinds of questions about, the Fourth Amendment protects us in our homes, but it needs to also protect persons and not just the places. And that is the key fight as we go forward. I think the private sector can make you those security guarantees, but unfortunately in the homeland security culture, the horse is a little bit out of the barn. If companies wanted to keep their databases completely private and secure, would they be able to? Or is regulation and legislation going to require them to share that with the federal government? And there are a lot of recent examples. Right after the terrorist attacks, there was the Terrorism Information Awareness Program. Just recently, there's the new National Terrorism Information Center program that's sweeping up data. So I have a lot of faith in the ability of, in the potential of technologies to do good things. But when we blur the compulsory with the voluntary, we run into real problems. But we'll get back to some of that.
Sure, Barry.
+1 to all that. And I'll pick up by saying that there's a tendency when we come to talking about the private sector to fall prey to moral panics. This happens with every new technology. People, they get very worked up about the implications of the technology, and they forget that the issues are not entirely new. And it seems to me that facial recognition really is photography plus math. And if you want an equation, it's photography plus math equal identification. But that's not the end of the story. When we talk about facial recognition, what we're really, in most cases, talking about is actually identification plus use. So there are really two steps here. Now, on the first two steps, I believe in free speech. I believe in an open and transparent society, as David Brin called it, which means that I think it's a good thing that the people who wanted to live in an opt-in world for photography lost. And that when we take photos on the street, as I do, as this gentleman here is doing, we don't have to get people's consent to do that. I think that's protected by the First Amendment. I think math is an understanding of the world that also increasingly we're going to see protected by the First Amendment as understanding that it is part of the process of understanding facts around us. The Supreme Court said this very clearly in the Sorrell case. It's about how we understand the world. Now, the opportunity for us to protect consumers, which I think there is a role for government in doing, is on that step that comes after that. It is on the uses of information. And Wayne has just been talking about the uses by government. I would only add to what he said that it's not just the national security world, it's also law enforcement. And in addition to dealing with the way that national security uses can certainly harm individual users, I think this conversation often doesn't deal with not only the Fourth Amendment issues, the idea that, for example, government should be required to get a warrant before it correlates two different databases that they might have. We saw this happen in Britain, where they started to correlate their database of driver's license photos with images that were taken from closed-circuit televisions. That's where the Fourth Amendment comes into play. But there's another area which is standards of evidence in court. So if you were in one of those riots in Britain, if you happened to be on the street, you might very well have found yourself charged in court because maybe you looked like somebody that was throwing a brick into a window. That's not a new issue. It's an area that the courts have dealt with over time and courts need to deal with, and maybe Congress has a role. But what I'm really concerned about is the other sets of uses that Wayne has only alluded to, which is uses by the private sector. And this idea that we have to do something because consumers just are uncomfortable with this technology. They don't expect that it's being used, which is different from saying we have to do something about this technology because it can genuinely harm people. So in brief, I would simply say that we already have good legal doctrines for dealing with these problems. The Federal Trade Commission rightly protects consumers not only against deception, but also against unfair practices. And those are practices that cause a substantial injury without a countervailing benefit that consumers themselves can't avoid. I think if we stick to that basic framework, we can deal with the harmful uses of facial recognition without trying to restrict the underlying photography and math that I think we really should let happen freely. And we should protect consumers, for example, from uses of their information to harm them for credit purposes. We already have law on that. We have a rich body of law. And then finally, as Wayne has said, we also have property law. We have ways of dealing with problems like intrusion. So part of the FTC's report talks about making sure that companies don't place cameras in sensitive places. Well, we already have well-developed law that says very similar things about not placing cameras in bathrooms. And I would refer all of you just on this point in closing to Jane Yakowitz, professor at now Arizona State Law School, has done very good work on both free speech and privacy, but also more recently on the tort of intrusion. And essentially she offers a conceptual framework for understanding why there are some circumstances where having a camera do facial recognition in the bathroom really is a problem. So again, I think if we work from basic existing areas of law, we get to a place that on the one hand allows us to protect consumers from real harms, restricts government from truly infringing on our constitutional liberties, but also allows us to develop a new and exciting technology in the way that the camera itself was developed and not fall prey to the sort of moral panics that I think too often come up in privacy.
Sure. Pam, you're next on the line. Can talk about consumer expectations here. I mean, going back to what the FTC report had said, what consumers think is being collected and done with that information. What are you hearing? What are you seeing?
Okay. So if it's all right, I'm going to deal with that as a third point. Okay. So I wanted to talk about first 70% of the facial recognition market, not facial detection, but facial recognition, where people are actually affirmatively identified and then matched. 70% of that is government and law enforcement, and this is a worldwide statistic. The number in terms of, investment is approximately $6 billion, although I think that you may be able to advance that number a little bit. That's for US dollars in 2012. Now, in 2014, that number is expected to rise to $9 billion. The reason for the rise is not an increase of that 70% market share of government and law enforcement. It's because the technology is moving to private enterprise and commercial, in particular retail, for anti-shoplifting purposes. That's the next really big deployment that people are looking at. This, I think, is a very important starting place. And I think that's number one. But number two is that when you start working with people who actually work in biometrics, their first rule that they're always quoting is that the first rule is you must tailor the biometric to the situation it's being placed in. So it's actually very challenging to talk about facial recognition technology with a super broad brush, because depending on how it's being deployed really changes how you tailor that technology. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. One example would be in Kenya, where actually Morpho sent out BVD kits or biometric kits to create a voter registration card with facial recognition. It was controversial, it was expensive, but that's what they chose to do, and it was done with a kit. It was an extraordinary phenomena, really. That's one situation. Another situation is in India, where biometric technology is being used to advance a national identity card, which is semi-voluntary. I could talk more about that, but then you go to the UK, where they, because of the Protection of Freedoms Act of 2012, they have their very first surveillance commissioner who came out this last fall, and he said, look, I'm a former police officer, and I'm telling you that absolutely no one expects this technology to be working the way it actually is, and this gets to your consumer expectation point. When we walk into Walgreens or CVS or through an airport where we see those big, giant, clunky screens that are kind of grainy, that's just a ruse. It's ridiculous, because what actually is the case is the cameras are very small, they're high definition, and they can identify us a half a mile away. So the technology is very advanced. So to come to my point, the US represents less than 5% of the market for biometric technologies. The developing world represents in excess of 20%, just immediately, just looking at one country like India. If you add in other nations in Asia, it gets higher very quickly, especially China. So we need to really be careful of what I call the government loop. So the technologies are developed by the government, then move to free or to the open market. This happens in the US in an orderly way with a lot of rights. But in the other parts of the world, what we're seeing is that it's not moving in such a nice way. And this is actually one of our great concerns with facial recognition technologies, because due to the way the internet works, these really super free-form commercial uses are wheeling back into the US through technologies that are simply worldwide at this point. So that's a concern. The other thing is, though, consumer expectation of privacy. I've really come to the conclusion that if we base our privacy protections based on what consumers expect, we'll have more than 1 million different privacy policies. It's a really bad way of making policy. I propose that, especially in the area of facial recognition technology, consumers don't expect pretty much what's happening right now. And I don't know that it's possible to educate as millions and millions of consumers as would need to be educated to actually have this be meaningful. So I think we're going to have to really look hard at collection and use and all of the different things that we always have to talk about regarding fair information practices in order to see where is the middle ground here. There's there's a whole lot of bell curve in the area of policymaking and facial recognition technology. There's the privacy side where people have a diffuse kind of non-articulate fear of the technology. And then there's the no regulation side, which has a similar diffuse fear of regulating a fairly new technology. And really, the sweet spot lies in the middle, which is really coming to grips with the challenging policy issues here. I think it's fair to say that we're not going to be able to stop the deployment of this technology. So the question then is, what's the next step?
Sure. Harley, now, when you were at CDT had worked pretty extensively on essentially facial recognition best practices. It's something that, you know, the organization has been talking about for a while now. It informs some of what the FTC did. Talk a little bit about that as you kind of sketch out for us the Hill perspective here.
So I actually do not want to represent the Hill perspective. As a Hill staffer, I need to stress at the outset that anything I say in the panel should be considered my personal opinion and thought only, and not the Congresswoman for whom I work. So first, I want to stress that the current technology is really quite sophisticated. It is entirely possible right now to set up, using relatively low-cost technology, a network that can identify large numbers of people, track them as they go from place to place, and associate those identities with other information, including their names, employment information, blog posts, shopper profiles, et cetera. And these same facial recognition systems, again, using existing technology, can also identify things that are not necessarily associated with your facial geometry, such as whether you're wearing glasses, earrings, necklaces, whether you have a beard. And some of the more cutting-edge ones, but that are already operational, can actually pick up on your emotional states, whether you are anxious or depressed or happy. And some can even pick up on your health state. So there are some that can actually measure the blood flow in your face and use that to determine your blood pressure, your blood oxygen levels. So the point is that the privacy interest is actually very massive. And because it is massive, consumers will want to have to be notified and have a choice as to whether or not they're being included in these systems. And so it is very much in the best interest of businesses to give them that notice and that choice. And my impression is that many of the businesses that are currently using technologies like this are giving them that choice. But it is challenging just by the very nature of the technology. And in terms of talking broadly about legislation, any baseline consumer privacy legislation that fails to include this issue of privacy in public with computer vision and audition systems is incomplete and is doomed to irrelevancy in just a matter of years. However, any such legislation or regulation will need to be harmonized with our very important right to take photos and record audio in public. And that is actually, I think, one of the more challenging policy issues with regard to privacy today. Pam and I actually both independently had worked on sets of self-regulatory guidelines for businesses, and they are really quite consistent. Our recommendation was that for something like facial detection, so you're not actually identifying a unique individual in more than one place, they have notice. You just let consumers know that it is happening. And although it is not perhaps the best solution, it is the only solution that I think is out there right now. That way consumers, if they know it's happening, can then leave the venue. They can walk away. It's privacy by walking away. But we've recommended that consumers get opt-in consent to any kind of facial recognition. And my understanding is that most companies are not using facial recognition, at least in offline retail settings, although that is changing. I have read about deployments, particularly in Japan, that are in fact recognizing repeat customers. And so there's not that much data out there as to whether or not companies are complying with the self-regulatory guidelines that we had written, but even those guidelines are just a niche of the full capabilities of facial recognition. So again, we urge businesses to respect the privacy of individuals, and all the academics and think tanks that are out there that are thinking about this issue, any baseline consumer privacy legislation has to take this First Amendment issue into account. And thus far, I've seen no literature that suggests a good way to do that.
Sure. Moving down the line, Scott, you have an interesting perspective as someone from industry. I want to make sure we have time to get through all the very, very many policy issues that we've raised so far, but give us your perspective and a little bit about what you do.
Well, Morpho is one of the biggest biometric companies in the world. So we are one of the leaders in facial recognition as well as fingerprint and iris. And the technology has really improved tremendously over the last 15 years. Our customers are primarily government. We do have commercial customers. But in the government context, it's largely forensic these days where all of the investment is going into. For instance, identifying that bank robber from that grainy photo. And in the forensic context, there is always, just as there is in the automated fingerprint systems that we see on TV, the way they actually work is that you often get a selection of possibilities and then there's a human element to arrive at a decision, because the human is still better at recognizing these patterns than math. So there's a process in the law enforcement area that I'm very comfortable with. I would like to add another technology to this panel, if I might. Iris, because iris and face go together. And the real driver technology-wise is the quality of the data that you bring in. And cameras are getting better and better. And you can film movies now on SLR. So you'll be able to take an iris that's good enough to get a match or an identification possibly in the future and probably the near future. Baron, I want to thank you for your freedom of math comment, because I describe our company as a collection of math geeks, because it's really all about the math in arriving at a solution that is reliable. But in order for it to work, there needs to be rules. There may be a message here that the company sent the lawyer to talk. And we're very keen on having the rules because it's in our interest not to have this technology become an anathema to all of our customers, because we want to continue to profit from it, frankly. So the rules in place can work. And one example is something we all are aware of: wiretapping. There's the Fourth Amendment, and there's the process at DOJ where I once worked that restricts that activity, and it also, in many contexts, is restricted by private citizens. And if you don't follow the rules, you can find yourself in a problem like News Corp. There are rules, but probably anybody in here with a short tutorial can learn how to wiretap anyone else's phone. It's not that difficult to do. So you have to have the rules to govern conduct, and you have to have the lawyers and the legal system that support it.
Sure. So let's talk about the rules. I want to explore some of the gaps here. It's hard when talking about facial recognition because we span such a very wide amount of technology and capability. But to begin, Commissioner, does the FTC have the legal tools it needs in this space? You know, in the Face Facts workshop and the report that you all produced, it was very clear that it wasn't a guiding document. It wasn't saying what the FTC was going to do in every situation. But I guess the larger question does reign. Does the FTC have the tools it needs, and how does it use those tools?
Sure. So the basic tools that we have, Section 5, which allows us to reach deception and unfairness. So deception is pretty clear, and you know, if you make a promise, we're gonna take this biometric data of you, this picture of you, or your iris, or whatever, and only use it for these purposes, and then use it for a different purpose. That's a pretty clear deception case, and we've brought a lot of cases not on biometric, facial recognition, but very similar kinds of cases already, and that's been at the basis of a lot of our enforcement. Now, unfairness is when there isn't a promise, and we've actually brought a lot of cases involving unfairness for failures to secure data sufficiently, take reasonable precautions. So, for example, if a company collects a whole database of people's faces and then doesn't secure that very well, and it gets accessed and abused, we can often say, well, that there's a consumer harm there, and you didn't need a promise. But we've defined fairly carefully what types of harms are unfair. So they have to be substantial, they can't be speculative, and they typically involve financial, health, safety, medical, and information about children, and also intrusions into the home. So when you start to think about a lot of these issues, I think that actually provides a pretty good framework. So for example, we brought a case last fall against a company called Designerware. And it was this rent-to-own, they work for rent-to-own computers, computer stores, where they had a program that could turn on the camera and take pictures, screenshots, but also turn on the camera and take pictures of what was happening around them and send it back to the rent-to-own store. And we challenged that under both deception and unfairness, but the harm from the unfairness being based on, some of the screenshots were financial data, some of it was medical data, but some of it was, people's private activities in their bedrooms being captured and sent back. And we thought that already met our standard of what's unfair. So we've been able to use it fairly. I like to be sure we're using it, we meet those definitions and don't go beyond too much, but I do think it gives us a lot of flexibility to address some of these. Barron looks anxious.
Barron does look anxious, and that's the question that I want to pose to you guys. Is Section 5 authority enough, or are there holes there? Does there need to be something from Congress, something from otherwise in federal government that takes it a little bit step further, gets the sort of law that perhaps we see in a state like Illinois, which is very clearly spelled out what you can and can't do with facial recognition technology? Barron, you look like you might explode, so you're more than welcome to go first.
I have no doubt that Commissioner Olhausen thinks very carefully about these things and is very prudent in understanding the limits of Section 5 and how far it can properly be stretched. I cannot say the same for the majority on the Commission. The FTC, before she got there, and subsequently, has clearly been changing its fundamental role. I think this chairman and the folks that have been running the Bureau of Consumer Protection think of the Commission as the nation's largest public interest law firm and not as a law enforcement agency. In other words, they have been pushing the boundaries of the law in two ways. One is stretching the boundaries of unfairness in particular, and the second is putting out a series of reports and otherwise using what Tim Wu, who coined the term net neutrality, has referred to favorably as agency threats. In other words, they have continued to pressure companies to do things that are nominally voluntary. So I actually am deeply concerned about where the agency is going with their authority here. I think that unfairness is the right standard for dealing with these basic problems. I'm afraid that it's going to be stretched too far and that the agency is actually making what Randy Picker calls non-law law in the process of putting out all of these reports and in the process of issuing these consent decrees, settling cases that never actually go before the courts. And I would only close by saying here that we finally actually have now pending litigation that may actually resolve some of these questions. Commissioner Olhausen referred to the fact that the Commission has brought a series of data security cases saying you have to have reasonable data security practices, and that's clearly at the heart of at least part of the recommendations in the facial recognition report. And Wyndham Hotels has challenged that, arguing that for a variety of reasons the Commission has failed to establish that those practices are actually unfair. That decision, if it comes out in the way that I think it might, really could really shake the foundations of a lot of the FTC's non-law law in this area. So we'll see. And I would only say I'm not against legislation. It may in fact be that we don't want to stretch Section 5 too far. But
Sure.
the basic framework is the right one.
Well, let's jump in. Firstly, I'm being told we have very limited time now because the first panel ran over time. Second, I want to change the question a little bit here. We're talking about, in this instance, what happens when companies screw up entirely. What about when companies are actually collecting that information, or on the back end when they've stored that information? There's a little bit there with Section 5, as the commissioner had said, but is the notice and consent regime sufficient enough? Is the consent regime there? Are those protections sufficient, and is that where Congress needs to get involved? Harley or Pam, you look like you have.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a really brief, quick statement. Unfairness is always, or deception is always, if I'm going to do something, I'd much rather go with deception because it's just so much easier. I think unfairness is a really challenging standard for a whole lot of reasons. However, that being said, I think in facial recognition technologies, not detection, but recognition, where you're actually tagging a person and identifying them and then using that for some purpose, I think that where law starts to come in really is, first off, of course, notice. And this is woefully inadequate at this point in this country. But I think that discrimination is actually probably a better tool. Something like ECOA, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, but for this sort of thing. If someone is being offered a higher price or some, less favorable terms on the basis of facial recognition in a commercial setting, that's a problem. I think that there are also law enforcement and government issues, but I don't think we're talking about that. There is one complicating factor here, and I don't know how it plays out, and that is the newly released regulations on COPPA. So COPPA now includes children, photos of children specifically. And in terms of facial recognition tools, I don't think we really know how children are being captured and identified in this country at this point. Now in Japan, it's already being done in, for example, the JR East installment in a very large shopping mall. But I don't think it's being done here yet. If that ever happened, I think there'd be a real COPPA problem, which would be very clear Section 5 authority for the FTC. In terms of facial detection, a kid walks into the store, right? And retail digital signage detects that this is a kid and then changes some kind of ad or some kind of marketing or something because there's a child under the age of 13 there. I think this is a very, very challenging proposition on so many levels. I don't think that anyone has really sorted that out, but I think it has now become a real issue. Where are the real harms here? I think the real harms have to be articulated. We need to find out what's really improper use of this data and where the real risk is so we don't skew our attention to places where ultimately the real harms aren't. So I think we actually need a lot more work to identify the really substantive harms.
Sure. Harley, you had a thought.
So your original question, no, I don't think that the FTC Act is sufficient. As a personal matter, again, I'd like to see baseline consumer privacy legislation. This is not just about the harms that facial recognition can cause or computer vision systems can cause, harms which the FTC often focuses on, nor is it just about whether the spiders are coming in under your door. I tried at the beginning of the panel to sort of sketch out the capabilities of the technology, at least taken to an extreme, where we can identify people, associate a lot of information about them, pick up on their emotional state, some of their health information, and so forth. And consumers will want to have a choice in whether or not they participate in this. And they want to know whether or not they participate in this. And their participation may not, in fact, result in an articulable harm. But again, the privacy impact is massive. This can completely change the dynamic of privacy in public. And unless there are rules that look beyond harms or rules that look beyond the home, consumers will have no choice, and this sort of system can be out there, consumers will be in it, and they can't get out. And again, the dynamic of privacy in public will be completely different. And I think that there is a role for government there in setting some limits, or at least articulating some of the boundaries for the use of technology like that.
Wayne, briefly.
Just real brief, I appreciate where Harley is coming from, but I just want to remind you, keep in mind that privacy is a competitive feature. It has to be. And that's one of the reasons why I think you mentioned you don't see a lot of abuses yet. And I think, remember, there isn't self-regulation. Nobody has that luxury. If you're operating in the tech space, you're not operating alone. You've got upstream business customers and suppliers that you're dealing with, downstream business customers, consumers, the FTC. There are a lot of forces arrayed against any company in the economy. Now, I think that matters a lot, and I'm not at the point where I'm ready to say that marketing counts as a harm, except with respect to children. I don't think that's appropriate in a lot of ways. But I always circle back to stressing, don't look at the chicken when there's a T-Rex coming up. I'm really concerned about the governmental collection of data and the blurring of public and private databases and how that prevents the private sector in the future from ever making you any privacy guarantees. If
Sure.
we've screwed it up before, how do we wall it off and not, we have to build up those concepts.
I want to touch on
I absolutely agree.
Yeah, I want to touch on self-regulation in a moment. We've got about 5 minutes left or something super short like that. Barry, you have a quick thought about.
Yeah, just really quickly, the answer is targeted legislation focused on uses. Things like FICRA would address the point that Pam has just talked about. And then conceptually, when we talk about competition, just let me give you an example. What if stores and places that you went in the business world simply use structured data disclosures to make accessible whether they use facial recognition and how it works, so that when you went in on Yelp, you could have a filter on Yelp that said, don't even show me stores that use facial recognition. That's the kind of technological change that I think would really enable the kind of competition on privacy that Wayne is talking about. So those are two ways, focusing on uses and focusing on improving transparency and competition, that we can get involved here to protect consumers without either killing a new technology or impinging on the First Amendment.
Sure, let's talk about self-regulation. You know, there are plenty of codes of conduct that exist on anything related to privacy, and obviously facial recognition with respect to digital signage is one of those things. Do we think self-regulatory efforts so far have worked? Are they falling by the wayside? You know, when we talk about behavioral advertising, we've got the DAA code of conduct, we've got the little blue icon. Some folks have argued about whether that's effective. When we're talking about facial recognition and digital signage, is that form of notice and consent effective, or what needs to be done to strengthen that self-regulatory regime? Commissioner, do you want to start?
Sure. So in our report, the Facing Facts report, we did mention several self-regulatory programs that were in place and that we thought had fairly good guidelines. One of the things that say, well, self-regulation, how is that enforceable? Certainly if a company says we adhere to these guidelines and they don't, then that's a pretty easy Section 5 case. And so that's sort of where the FTC can provide some backup in that area. Now, as for whether companies are complying with it, whether there's really a big problem out there, I still think a lot of this is still very early stages for saying, you know, there's a big problem that self-regulation in Section 5 and a lot of the other privacy laws that exist on health data and communications data and credit data, you know, may not already cover.
Sure, Pam.
Oh, yeah, I'm really proud of the work both Harley and I did on our self-regulatory regimes. It was interesting. We were just talking. It was, I believe, in 2010. We were both in Las Vegas announcing those, and we were on the same panel in this same convention center talking about these technologies. And I think that self-regulation has a really wonderful role as a proving ground and as a point for bringing together discussants, because without some really good, solid discussion where people are being honest, it's going to be very challenging to do proper legislation. So I think self-regulatory proposals are a good way of having that public discussion and hopefully having it be civil. One of the big issues that I have right now with the way the digital signage self-regulatory principles have been put into effect is that we're having trouble on the notice front. And notice as a measure of fairness and privacy is kind of poo-pooed. It's like, oh, well, who cares about notice? It doesn't do any good. I care about notice a lot. I really like it, and I think it does a lot of good. And I don't like the quote-unquote walkout, opt-out. I really don't. I mock it on a regular basis because I want more. But at the same time, it needs to be there as an option. And in an increasingly censored society, censor with an S, where there's a sensor on every lapel or in every glass or everything, it's going to be increasingly important to understand how we do notice when there's ubiquitous sensors. So we're not doing very well on the notice front, and I think that's the very first thing that needs to get better.
Sure. Harley, you wanted to jump in?
So there is not, as I said earlier, a whole lot of data out there about whether or not the self-regulatory guidelines are being followed in full. I do know that at least the Digital Signage Federation has instituted a seal of compliance that some companies are using. Some companies have expressed to me privately that they are in full compliance with the privacy guidelines. But I think the broader point is that it is extremely encouraging that companies wanted to get on board with these guidelines to begin with. Companies really are, for the most part, trying to do the right thing. Both those online companies that are using facial recognition and those digital signage offline style companies that are using it, which I think will benefit their businesses a great deal in the future. And this is in contrast, of course, to what happened with the online behavioral advertising space, which only adopted behavioral advertising self-regulatory guidelines after tremendous pressure from the government, from the FTC. And here, the companies did it proactively. I really hope that as the technology matures, these guidelines will become more widespread, more widely used, more important. But I will predict that facial recognition, not detection, will be increasingly used in a commercial sense for the simple reason that it will be profitable.
Great. Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming. Unfortunately, we have to cut this panel short. There's like hours of conversation, I think, still to be had here. Thanks again to our panelists, to Commissioner Olhausen for coming. And stick around. We've got more coming up. Thanks.
Well, that was the shortest panel ever.